Sometimes the most dangerous people in a billionaire's life are the ones already sitting at his dinner table. The rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of Whitmore House as Claire Bennett placed a porcelain coffee cup onto a silver tray with careful hands. The mansion glowed with warm golden light, but the atmosphere inside felt colder than the December storm outside. Wolf had a sound. Claire had learned that during her 2 years serving Manhattan's elite. It sounded like crystal glasses clinking beneath forced laughter. It sounded like expensive shoes crossing marble floors without hesitation. And tonight, it sounded like silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settled over a room right before something terrible happened. Claire adjusted the sleeve of her black uniform and stepped quietly through the dining hall. Around her, members of the Whitmore family sat beneath a chandelier worth more than most apartments in Brooklyn. Jonathan Whitmore occupied the head of the table, his posture perfectly straight, one hand resting beside a gold watch that reflected the candlelight like ice. At 52, Jonathan had built one of the largest media empires in America. People called him ruthless in business magazines, brilliant on Wall Street, untouchable. But tonight, exhaustion clung to him like a shadow. His youngest son, 16-year-old Ethan Whitmore, had been missing for almost 12 hours. Police officers moved quietly throughout the mansion while security teams checked cameras and phone records downstairs. Nobody touched the food. Nobody looked each other in the eye for very long. Claire moved between the guests with calm precision, refilling coffee cups no one intended to drink. She kept her eyes lowered. Waitresses survived in places like this by becoming invisible, but invisibility had taught Claire something dangerous. Invisible people heard everything. The press can't find out before morning, Jonathan said finally, his voice low and controlled. If this leaks tonight, every network in the country will smell blood. Across from him, Connor Whitmore loosened his tie with trembling fingers. Jonathan's older son looked pale beneath the dining room lights. Maybe Ethan just wanted space, Connor muttered. He's 16. Kids do stupid things. Eleanor Whitmore slowly lifted her gaze from the untouched soup in front of her. Even at 72, Jonathan's mother carried herself with quiet elegance. Her silver necklace rested perfectly against the dark blue silk of her dress, but her hands trembled slightly against the tablecloth. Ethan would never leave without calling me, she whispered. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loudly through the silence that followed. Claire approached carefully with the coffee pot. Steam curled softly into the air. Jonathan didn't look at her when he extended his cup. He rarely looked directly at staff. Men like Jonathan Whitmore saw service workers the way they saw furniture. Necessary. Replaceable. Forgettable. Claire poured the coffee without a sound. Then she heard it. Connor leaned toward the family attorney beside him, speaking barely above a whisper. By tomorrow night, he said quietly, the boy won't be a problem anymore. The attorney stiffened slightly. Claire noticed it immediately. A tiny reaction. Almost invisible. But enough. Her hand paused for half a second above Jonathan's cup. The coffee rippled gently against the porcelain. Nobody else at the table seemed to notice. Nobody except Claire. Connor leaned back in his chair, reaching for his water glass as though nothing had happened. Jonathan rubbed both hands across his face. The FBI will arrive within the hour, he said. Until then, nobody leaves this house. Lightning flashed outside the windows. For one brief second, the dining room turned white. Claire stepped away from the table slowly, but her heartbeat had changed. Something cold moved quietly beneath her ribs. She had learned long ago to trust that feeling. In another life, before debt and hospital bills and long overnight shifts, Claire had worked in behavioral analysis for a private consulting firm in Chicago. She knew fear when she saw it. Connor Whitmore wasn't afraid for his brother. He was afraid of something else. Claire carried the tray toward the kitchen, but Eleanor's voice stopped her halfway across the room. Miss Bennett. Claire turned politely. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor studied her carefully. You look pale. Claire forced a small smile. Just tired, ma'am. Jonathan exhaled sharply, impatient. Mother, please. Eleanor fell silent again. Claire nodded respectfully and continued walking toward the service hallway. But before she disappeared through the doors, she glanced back one final time. Connor Whitmore was staring directly at her. Not casually, not accidentally. His expression had gone completely still. And for the first time that night, Claire realized something terrifying. He knew she had heard him. 20 minutes later, Thunder rolled above Manhattan while Claire stood alone beside the coffee station downstairs. The mansion buzzed with quiet panic around her. Phones rang endlessly. Security guards crossed the marble floors with tense expressions. Somewhere above, Jonathan Whitmore was speaking to police officers behind closed doors. Claire stared at the untouched tray in front of her. Then slowly, she made a decision. She picked up a fresh cup of black coffee and walked toward Jonathan's private office. The assistant outside the door immediately blocked her path. "Mr. Whitmore isn't available." Claire tightened her grip on the tray. "I need 30 seconds. "Not happening." Claire lowered her voice. "Please. It's about Ethan." Before the assistant could answer, Jonathan's voice sounded from inside the office. "What now?" The door opened. Jonathan stood beneath the soft amber lights of the study. His tie loosened for the first time all evening. Irritation darkened his face the moment he saw her uniform. "What is this?" he asked coldly. Claire stepped inside carefully and placed the coffee onto his desk. The rain hammered harder against the windows now. Somewhere far away, a siren echoed through the city. Claire looked directly at Jonathan Whitmore for the first time since she began working there. Then she spoke softly. "Your son is not in danger because of the kidnapping, Mr. Whitmore." Jonathan's expression hardened instantly. "Excuse me." Claire swallowed once. "Calm. Precise. He's in danger because someone inside your family wants him gone." The room went completely silent. Jonathan Whitmore stared at Claire Bennett as though she had just spoken a language nobody else in the world understood. The rain pressed hard against the office windows behind him, blurring the Manhattan skyline into streaks of silver and black. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The soft ticking of the antique clock beside the bookshelf suddenly sounded impossibly loud. Then Jonathan laughed once. Short, cold, empty. "Do you have any idea what you are accusing my family of?" he asked quietly. Claire remained still. "I am not accusing anyone, sir." Jonathan stepped around the desk slowly, his polished shoes crossing the dark hardwood floor with measured control. Men like him built empires by controlling rooms, by controlling conversations, by never allowing uncertainty to show on their faces. But Claire noticed the small details people missed. The tension in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers brushed repeatedly against the edge of his watch. "You are a waitress," Jonathan said. "My son is missing. The police are already handling this. I suggest you go back downstairs and continue doing your job." Claire should have left. Every instinct told her to walk away and let powerful people destroy themselves in peace. But Ethan Whitmore's face stayed in her mind. The shy smile he gave staff members when nobody important was watching. The way he always thanked her for bringing hot chocolate during late family events. The boy had kindness in him. Rare kindness. And kindness rarely survived inside families built on power. "Last night," Claire said softly, "someone at dinner said Ethan would not be a problem by tomorrow night." Jonathan's expression darkened immediately. "Who?" Claire hesitated. Connor's face flashed through her memory. Pale skin beneath the chandelier light. Fingers trembling against the water glass. Fear disguised as irritation. "I am not completely certain," she answered carefully. "But somebody at that table knew more than they should have." Jonathan's patience finally cracked. "Not completely certain?" His voice rose sharply for the first time. "You interrupt a federal investigation with vague accusations, and now you are telling me you are uncertain?" Claire did not flinch. People reveal themselves before they realize anyone is listening. Jonathan walked toward the window, dragging one hand across his mouth. Below the estate grounds, black SUVs rolled through the rain while security teams moved beneath umbrellas. Every light in the mansion remained on. The entire house looked awake. Frightened houses always did. "You think you understand my family because you refill coffee cups?" Jonathan asked without turning around. Claire looked down briefly at the silver tray in her hands. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I understand your family because nobody notices the woman carrying the coffee." Silence settled heavily between them. Somewhere downstairs, a door slammed shut. Jonathan finally turned back toward her, and something colder had entered his expression now. Suspicion. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years. "And before that?" Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the tray. "Chicago." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Doing what?" Claire looked toward the rain-streaked windows instead of answering immediately. There were parts of her old life she preferred buried beneath distance and silence. "Consulting work," she said finally. Behavioral analysis. Jonathan stared at her carefully now, reevaluating everything. The quiet waitress suddenly no longer fit inside the simple category he had created for her. Claire recognized the exact moment his perception shifted. It always happened in silence. You expect me to believe a behavioral analyst is serving coffee in my dining room? Jonathan asked. Claire gave a faint smile that never reached her eyes. Life rearranges people. Before Jonathan could respond, the office door opened abruptly. Eleanor Whitmore stepped inside wrapped in a cream-colored shawl, her silver hair glowing softly beneath the hallway lights. Jonathan, she said breathlessly, the FBI agents have arrived. Then she noticed Claire standing near the desk. Her expression changed immediately. Eleanor looked from Claire to her son with growing concern. What happened? Jonathan exhaled sharply. Apparently our waitress believes somebody in this family harmed Ethan. Eleanor froze completely. Claire noticed the tiny movement of her hands tightening around the shawl fabric. Fear. Real fear. Not outrage. Not disbelief. Jonathan noticed it too. Mother, he asked slowly. Eleanor looked toward Claire with unsettling intensity. Why would you say something like that? Claire swallowed carefully. Because whoever took Ethan knew the security rotation changed at exactly 9:15 last night. Jonathan's head snapped toward her. That information was private. Claire nodded once. Exactly. The room went silent again. Eleanor slowly lowered herself into the leather chair near the fireplace. The elegant mask she wore in public had begun to crack around the edges. Jonathan, she whispered. Perhaps we should listen to her. Jonathan looked stunned. Mother, this is insane. Is it? Eleanor's voice trembled slightly now. Because I have spent the last 10 hours watching everyone in this family avoid each other's eyes. Jonathan ran both hands through his hair in frustration. You are both talking like this is some kind of conspiracy. Claire carefully placed the untouched coffee cup onto the edge of the desk. Steam still curled gently upward into the dim office light. People panic differently when they are hiding something, she said quietly. Some people get loud. Others become too calm. Jonathan stared at her. And which one is Connor? The question escaped before he could stop it. Claire noticed the instant regret crossed his face afterward. There it was. The first crack. The first moment Jonathan Whitmore allowed himself to think the impossible. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Jonathan stood at the center smiling beside his sons. Connor looked confident. Ethan looked uncertain. Eleanor looked tired. Perfect families often did. I think, Claire said softly, Connor is afraid. Thunder rolled across the city again. Then suddenly, downstairs, someone shouted. Fast footsteps echoed through the mansion. A security officer appeared breathless in the hallway outside the office door. Mr. Whitmore, he called urgently, we found Ethan's backpack. Jonathan's face drained of color. Where? Train station locker near Penn Station. The guard hesitated. There is something else inside it. Jonathan moved instantly toward the hallway. Eleanor rose slowly behind him, her hands trembling harder now. But Claire remained frozen beside the desk when the guard quietly added 4 words that changed the entire atmosphere inside the mansion. There was blood on it. The Whitmore mansion no longer sounded like a home. It sounded like a machine falling apart one quiet piece at a time. Jonathan Whitmore moved quickly through the marble hallway while 2 federal agents followed beside him, their dark coats dripping rainwater onto the polished floor. Claire walked several steps behind, unnoticed again, carrying the same silver tray no one had asked her to hold anymore. Sometimes invisible people stayed invisible simply because nobody remembered to tell them to leave. The security officer led them downstairs toward the private media room where evidence from the train station had already been delivered. Eleanor Whitmore walked carefully beside the wall, one trembling hand brushing against the wallpaper as though she suddenly needed help standing upright. Nobody spoke during the walk. Nobody wanted to say the words forming silently inside their minds. Missing children changed the air around families. Even billionaires could not buy oxygen once fear entered a room. Inside the media room, television screens glowed blue against the darkness, while FBI agents studied maps and surveillance footage. A black backpack rested on the large conference table beneath bright overhead lights. Ethan's initials were stitched onto the side in silver thread. Jonathan stopped walking the moment he saw it. Claire noticed his shoulders stiffen before he reached for the chair beside the table. One of the agents carefully unzipped the front pocket. We found the bag inside locker 214 at Penn Station approximately 40 minutes ago, the agent explained calmly. The station employee noticed reddish stains near the zipper and contacted authorities. Eleanor covered her mouth quietly. Connor Whitmore stood near the far wall now, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had arrived moments earlier after security pulled him from a phone call upstairs. His expression looked controlled again. Too controlled. Claire watched him carefully. Fear had become calculation. Was there a note? Jonathan asked. His voice sounded thinner now, older somehow. The agent shook his head. No ransom demand yet. Another investigator placed several items onto the table one by one. Ethan's wallet, a transit card, a broken phone charger. Then finally, a navy blue scarf with dark stains along the fabric edge. The room fell silent again. Claire noticed Connor glance toward the scarf for half a second before quickly looking away. Tiny reactions mattered. Tiny reactions built truth. We are testing everything now, the agent continued. At this point, we cannot confirm whether the stains belong to Ethan. Jonathan leaned both hands against the table, staring down at the backpack as though he could force it to explain where his son had gone. Rainwater still clung faintly to the leather straps. This does not make sense, he whispered. Ethan hated Penn Station. He always said it smelled like metal and exhaustion. Claire remembered that too. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had joked about it while waiting for the family driver outside the restaurant entrance. Small memories suddenly became painful after people disappeared. Eleanor slowly sat down near the edge of the room. Jonathan, she said softly, maybe we should tell them. Jonathan looked up immediately. Tell them what? Connor's head turned sharply toward his grandmother. Claire saw it instantly. Panic. Real panic this time. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pearl bracelet at her wrist. About the argument yesterday. Jonathan's expression darkened. Mother. But Eleanor continued quietly. Ethan and Connor fought in the library before dinner. One of the FBI agents looked up from his notes immediately. About what? Connor answered before anyone else could speak. It was nothing. His voice came too fast. Too smooth. Brothers argue. That is all. Claire studied him carefully beneath the dim lights. Connor Whitmore had the polished confidence of someone raised inside expensive schools and private boardrooms. But cracks had begun forming beneath the surface tonight. Tiny ones. Dangerous ones. Jonathan looked between his son's empty chair and Connor's face. What kind of argument? Connor exhaled sharply. Ethan accused me of trying to control his trust fund after your retirement announcement. It was ridiculous. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. Retirement announcement? The room shifted. Claire noticed it immediately. Even the agents stopped writing. Jonathan slowly straightened his posture. Connor, he said carefully, I have not publicly announced any retirement plans. Silence. Connor blinked once, then twice. Too late. He realized the mistake immediately. Claire saw the exact second it happened. Jonathan's face changed. Not anger yet. Something colder. Recognition. You told Ethan I was stepping down? Jonathan asked quietly. Connor forced a laugh that sounded hollow in the dark room. I assumed eventually you would. But nobody laughed with him. Claire lowered her eyes toward the coffee stain drying faintly against the silver tray in her hands. The room had changed again. Families built on power often collapsed the same way towers did. Not from explosions. From pressure hidden inside the structure for too long. Eleanor suddenly looked exhausted. Jonathan, she whispered, there is something else. Connor's head snapped toward her. Grandmother. She ignored him completely. 2 weeks ago, Ethan came to my room very upset. He said he overheard Connor arguing with someone on the phone. Jonathan stared at his older son. About what? Eleanor's voice trembled now. Money. Connor stepped forward immediately. This is insane. His composure finally cracked around the edges. I have businesses. Investments. Everyone here talks about money. But Claire noticed the sweat forming near his collar despite the cold room. Jonathan noticed too. How much debt are you in? Jonathan asked quietly. Connor froze completely. The question landed harder than any accusation. One of the FBI agents slowly closed his notebook. Nobody moved for several long seconds. Then Connor finally spoke. It is temporary. Jonathan looked at him as though seeing him clearly for the first time in years. How much? Connor swallowed hard. About 30 million. Eleanor closed her eyes. The room seemed to lose warmth instantly. Claire stood perfectly still near the doorway while thunder rolled above Manhattan once more. Jonathan Whitmore did not shout. He did not slam his fists against the table. Men truly raised in power rarely needed volume. Instead, he walked slowly toward his older son with terrifying calm. And Ethan knew? Connor looked away first. That was the answer. Claire felt it immediately. The entire room did. Jonathan inhaled slowly through his nose. Then he asked the question nobody in the mansion wanted answered. What exactly was Ethan threatening to expose? Connor Whitmore looked like a man trying to hold together a glass wall with bare hands. One crack had already appeared, and everyone in the room could hear it spreading. The blue glow from the surveillance monitors reflected across his face, while rain continued sliding down the tall basement windows behind him. Jonathan Whitmore stood perfectly still in front of his older son, waiting for an answer that already frightened him. Claire remained near the doorway beside the silver tray, silent as ever. Invisible people survived by understanding when silence carried more weight than words. Connor loosened his tie again with trembling fingers. Ethan misunderstood things, he said finally. He overheard private conversations and turned them into drama. Jonathan's expression did not change. What private conversations? Connor looked toward the federal agents as though searching for an escape route hidden somewhere inside the room. But there was none. Wealth could buy lawyers. It could buy influence. It could even buy time. But it could not buy back a sentence once fear had spoken it aloud. I borrowed money, Connor admitted quietly. Eleanor lowered her eyes immediately. She already knew. Claire saw it instantly. Jonathan noticed too. From who? Jonathan asked. Connor hesitated too long. One of the agents stepped forward slightly. Mr. Whitmore, if your son is involved with dangerous creditors, this information becomes extremely relevant to Ethan's disappearance. Connor laughed nervously under his breath. Dangerous creditors, he repeated. You people make it sound like I joined organized crime. Nobody smiled. Connor's face hardened. I invested in technology startups after the market collapsed last year. I lost more than expected. Jonathan folded his arms slowly across his chest. $30 million is not a bad investment. It is a catastrophe. Connor's jaw tightened. I was trying to build something outside your company for once. The room went quiet again. Claire watched Jonathan carefully. The billionaire's face remained calm, but disappointment moved behind his eyes now, like something heavy sinking underwater. And Ethan found out. Jonathan asked. Connor nodded once. He overheard a call. With whom? Connor swallowed hard. A lender. Claire noticed the way he avoided saying the name. Another tiny crack. Another hidden detail. The FBI agent nearest the table leaned forward slightly. Did this lender threaten you? Connor looked irritated now instead of afraid. Defensive. This is Manhattan, he snapped. Everyone threatens, everyone over money. Jonathan's voice dropped lower. More dangerous. Did Ethan threaten to tell me? Connor did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. Eleanor pressed both hands together in her lap, as though praying silently beneath the table. Claire suddenly remembered Ethan sitting alone near the restaurant kitchen 2 months earlier while waiting for the family driver. He had looked exhausted that night, too. Do rich families ever get tired pretending they like each other? He had asked quietly while stirring marshmallows in a hot chocolate. Claire had almost laughed at the honesty in his voice. Almost. Sometimes, she had answered gently. People confuse control with love. Ethan had stared into the cup for several seconds before whispering, "That sounds like my brother." Claire returned to the present as Jonathan stepped closer toward Connor. You said Ethan misunderstood things, Jonathan said carefully. What exactly did he misunderstand? Connor looked exhausted now. Not guilty yet. Just cornered. He thought I wanted him removed from the inheritance structure after you retired. Jonathan's expression sharpened instantly. Removed? Connor raised both hands quickly. Financially removed. But the room no longer trusted his choice of words. Claire could feel it. So could Connor. The agent near the monitors opened a folder quietly. Mr. Whitmore, he said, we recovered deleted text messages from Ethan's tablet earlier tonight. Connor's face lost color. Jonathan turned immediately. What messages? The agent glanced toward Connor first before answering. Ethan sent a message to a classmate around 6:30 yesterday evening. The room felt smaller suddenly. Colder. The agent read directly from the report. If anything happens to me, Connor knows why. Silence hit the room like winter air. Jonathan slowly looked back toward his older son. Connor shook his head instantly. Teenagers say dramatic things all the time. But even his voice sounded weaker now. Eleanor covered her eyes briefly with trembling fingers. Claire remained motionless near the doorway, but inside her chest, the same cold instinct from earlier had returned stronger than before. Something was wrong beyond money, beyond inheritance. Fear this deep never came from debt alone. Then another agent entered the room, holding a transparent evidence bag. "We found this hidden inside the backpack lining," she said quietly. Inside the plastic sat a silver flash drive no larger than a thumb. Jonathan frowned immediately. "Ethan's? Possibly." The agent placed it carefully onto the table. "We are scanning it now." Connor suddenly took one step backward. Tiny movement. Tiny panic. Claire noticed immediately. Jonathan noticed too. "What is on that drive?" Jonathan asked softly. Connor's breathing changed. "Faster now." "I do not know." Nobody believed him. The lights flickered once as thunder rolled over Manhattan again. Then the main monitor suddenly beeped. An analyst seated across the room looked up sharply from his laptop. "We opened the drive." Everyone turned toward the screen. File folders appeared one by one beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Bank records, offshore account summaries, property transfers. Then finally, a folder labeled simply, Connor. Jonathan stared at the screen without blinking. "Open it," he ordered. The analyst clicked once. A video file appeared, time-stamped 3 nights earlier. The footage loaded slowly through static before Ethan's face finally appeared on screen. Pale, nervous, looking directly into the camera from what looked like his bedroom. "If you are watching this," Ethan said quietly, "it means something already happened." Connor whispered one word under his breath. "No." Claire looked toward him carefully. Not anger this time. Terror. Real terror. On the screen, Ethan inhaled shakily before continuing. "Connor thinks I only know about the money. But that is not the real problem." Jonathan stepped closer to the monitor. The entire room held its breath. Then Ethan spoke the sentence that changed everything. "The person Connor owes money to works inside Dad's company." The room forgot how to breathe. Ethan Whitmore's face remained frozen on the screen beneath the pale blue glow of the monitor while rain continued whispering against the basement windows. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away. Jonathan Whitmore stared at the image of his missing son as though the world had suddenly tilted beneath his feet. Connor stood near the edge of the conference table, one hand gripping the back of a leather chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Claire Bennett remained silent near the doorway, but inside her chest, something heavy settled into place. The instinct she trusted had been right from the beginning. Ethan had not disappeared randomly. He had been afraid. On the monitor, Ethan inhaled slowly before continuing. "Connor thinks he can fix everything before Dad finds out," he said quietly into the camera. "But he does not understand these people. They are not investors. They are dangerous." The recording crackled softly for a second. Ethan glanced nervously toward his bedroom door before lowering his voice even further. "If something happens to me, check the old Hudson Media building downtown. Connor met someone there 3 nights ago." The video ended abruptly. Silence swallowed the room again. Jonathan looked at the dark screen for several long seconds without blinking. Then finally, very softly, he asked, "What building?" One of the FBI agents checked the notes quickly. "Hudson Media Annex, Lower Manhattan. It has been vacant since the merger 4 years ago." Jonathan slowly turned toward Connor. No anger yet, just disbelief. "You brought criminals into my company." Connor shook his head immediately. "It was never supposed to become this serious." Eleanor pressed trembling fingers against her lips. "Connor." He looked exhausted now, hollowed out by fear and shame all at once. "I lost money," he whispered. "A lot of money. And I thought I could recover it quietly before Dad found out." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "So you borrowed from someone connected to the company?" Connor nodded once. At first it was small. Claire noticed how carefully he avoided eye contact now. Then the interest grew. They started asking for favors. One of the agents stepped forward. "What kind of favors?" Connor hesitated too long again. "Information," he admitted quietly. "Future acquisitions. Internal market strategy." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. The billionaire who controlled billion-dollar negotiations suddenly looked older than the storm outside. "Corporate espionage," he said under his breath. Connor immediately shook his head harder. I never gave them anything major. Claire noticed Jonathan's expression change slightly at those words. Not relief. Recognition. Powerful men understood one thing deeply. Nobody ever confessed the full truth first. Who were they? Jonathan asked quietly. Connor stared at the floor. A consulting group. One of the federal agents almost laughed. That is not an answer. Connor finally looked up. Fear had fully replaced arrogance now. Their leader called himself Victor Hale. The room shifted again. Two agents exchanged immediate looks. Claire noticed it. Jonathan noticed too. You know the name? Jonathan asked sharply. The older FBI agent nodded slowly. Victor Hale has been linked to financial coercion cases for years. Nothing sticks because witnesses disappear financially before they ever testify. Careers collapse. Debt suddenly vanishes. People become cooperative. Eleanor looked horrified. And Ethan found out about this? Connor nodded weakly. He overheard one of my calls. Jonathan walked slowly toward the far side of the room, loosening his tie again with stiff movements. The image of control he carried in public had begun cracking apart tonight piece by piece. Did Ethan threaten to expose you? Jonathan asked without turning around. Connor swallowed hard. No, Jonathan stopped walking. Then why was he afraid? Connor opened his mouth, closed it again. Claire watched carefully. There it was. The hidden part. The thing Connor still refused to say aloud. Jonathan turned back slowly. What are you not telling us? Connor looked toward the dark monitor screen, where Ethan's frozen face still remained visible. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Because Ethan heard something else. Claire felt the room tighten around that sentence. What? Jonathan asked. Connor rubbed both hands across his face. Victor Hale did not just want company information anymore. Eleanor's breathing became uneven beside the table. Connor, he wanted leverage. Jonathan stared at him silently. Connor finally forced himself to continue. He said if I failed to pay everything back before the end of the year, they would create pressure inside the family. The FBI agent frowned immediately. Pressure how? Connor looked sick now. Truly sick. Public scandals. Financial investigations. Manipulated stories in the media. Jonathan gave a bitter laugh beneath his breath. Weaponizing my own industry against me. But Connor was not finished. Claire could feel it. And? Jonathan asked quietly. Connor's eyes finally filled with shame. And Ethan heard Victor mention kidnapping insurance policies. The room froze completely. Eleanor's coffee cup slipped from her trembling hands and shattered softly against the floor. Nobody reacted to the sound. Claire watched Jonathan Whitmore very carefully then. Most people expected billionaires to explode when their worlds collapsed. To scream. To threaten. But truly dangerous men became quieter when pain reached its deepest point. Jonathan crouched slowly beside the broken porcelain pieces scattered across the marble floor. He picked up the silver spoon lying among the spilled coffee and stared at it for several long seconds. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Did Victor Hale take my son? Connor's voice broke slightly. I do not know. Jonathan stood again. Calm. Too calm. That is no longer good enough. The room remained silent except for the distant rumble of thunder outside the mansion. Then suddenly another analyst near the monitors looked up sharply. Sir, he said carefully, we recovered security footage from outside the Hudson Annex building. Jonathan walked toward the screen immediately. Grainy black and white footage appeared from a rain-soaked alley camera downtown. A black SUV parked near the empty building shortly after midnight, 3 nights earlier. Connor appeared exiting the passenger side. Then another figure stepped from the shadows beside him. Tall, dark coat, face hidden beneath an umbrella. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. Something about the man's posture felt familiar. Then the figure turned briefly toward the security camera. Jonathan went completely still. So did Claire. Because both of them recognized the man at exactly the same moment. He was not a stranger. He worked inside Whitmore Media. Jonathan whispered the name slowly, almost unable to believe it himself. Daniel Mercer. Daniel Mercer had worked beside Jonathan Whitmore for almost 15 years. The realization settled over the room like cold smoke. Nobody spoke at first. The grainy security footage continued looping silently across the monitor while rain washed against the mansion windows above them. Daniel Mercer stepping from the shadows. Connor beside him. The black SUV waiting at the curb like a secret nobody expected to survive daylight. Jonathan Whitmore stared at the screen without blinking. Claire Bennett watched him carefully from near the doorway. She had spent years studying human behavior before life rearranged her into someone invisible. She knew the exact moment betrayal became personal. It was never loud. It happened quietly, in the eyes first. Jonathan finally stepped closer toward the monitor. "Replay it," he said softly. The analyst obeyed immediately. The footage rolled again. Connor exiting the vehicle. Mercer appearing beneath the umbrella. Two men exchanging a folder near the empty building entrance. Jonathan's expression hardened further with every second. Zoom in on the timestamp. The analyst enlarged the corner of the footage. Tuesday night, 11:42 p.m. Eleanor Whitmore slowly lowered herself into the nearest chair as though her legs no longer trusted the floor. "Daniel came to dinner the next evening," she whispered faintly. "He sat at our table." Jonathan did not answer. Claire noticed his hands now resting flat against the conference table, perfectly controlled. Too controlled. Connor looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Dad, I did not know Ethan would disappear." Jonathan finally turned toward him. "But you knew Mercer was involved with Victor Hale." Connor rubbed both hands across his face. "Mercer introduced me to him after the market collapse. He said Hale specialized in private restructuring loans." One of the federal agents almost sighed under his breath. "Private restructuring." Connor snapped defensively. "I was desperate." Jonathan's voice remained terrifyingly calm. "You brought criminals into my company because you were desperate." Claire noticed Connor glance toward the door briefly. Tiny instinct. Tiny escape thought. Fear often looked for exits before truth fully arrived. "Mercer said nobody would get hurt," Connor whispered. "He promised they only wanted internal projections to manipulate market timing." Jonathan laughed once beneath his breath. Bitter. Sharp. "And you believe that?" Connor's silence answered everything. One of the agents stepped toward the monitors. "Daniel Mercer currently serves as chief financial strategist for Whitmore Media. Full access to internal acquisitions, private communications, executive schedules." Eleanor slowly looked up. "He knows everything about this family." The room fell silent again. Claire remembered Mercer immediately. Expensive charcoal suits, silver cufflinks, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had eaten at the restaurant upstairs dozens of times beside Jonathan over the past 2 years. Unlike most wealthy executives, Mercer always looked directly at staff members when speaking to them. At first, Claire had mistaken that for kindness. Later, she realized it was calculation. Men who manipulated rooms needed to study everyone inside them, even invisible people. "Where is Mercer now?" Jonathan asked. The analyst typed rapidly across the keyboard. "His phone disconnected approximately 90 minutes ago." Connor suddenly looked sick again. "He knows Ethan recorded that video." Claire felt the room tighten instantly around those words. Jonathan stepped closer toward his older son. "How?" Connor swallowed hard. "Ethan confronted me yesterday afternoon. He said he copied files from my laptop." Jonathan's eyes darkened. "And you told Mercer?" Connor looked away immediately. Another answer. Another crack. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "Oh, Connor, I was trying to calm the situation down," he whispered desperately. "Mercer said he would handle it quietly." Jonathan's expression changed completely then. Not disappointment anymore. Understanding. Dangerous understanding. Claire recognized it immediately. The billionaire had finally stopped treating this like a family crisis. Now he was thinking like a man preparing for war. "The train station backpack," Jonathan said slowly. "It was planted." One of the agents nodded. "Most likely." Claire spoke for the first time in several minutes. Quietly. Mercer wanted everyone focused on fear. The room turned toward her again. Jonathan looked at her differently now. Not as staff. Not even as an outsider. He was finally listening. Claire continued softly. "Fear narrows people. It keeps them reacting instead of thinking." Jonathan studied her face carefully. "You sound very certain." Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the silver tray still resting in her hands. "Because manipulation follows patterns." Connor looked exhausted. "Mercer said Ethan only needed time to calm down." Jonathan's voice sharpened instantly. "And you believed a man connected to extortionists would calmly babysit your brother?" Connor finally broke. "I did not know what to believe anymore." His voice cracked hard enough to echo through the room. Every mistake kept getting bigger. Every lie kept multiplying. Eleanor wiped quietly at tears gathering near her eyes. "You should have come to us." Connor laughed weakly beneath his breath. "To Dad." He looked toward Jonathan. You built this family like one of your companies. Performance mattered more than honesty. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Jonathan did not defend himself. That silence said enough. Claire looked toward the rain-streaked windows. Families rarely collapsed from a single betrayal. Most broke slowly from years of people learning to hide pain from each other. Then suddenly one of the younger analysts sat upright at the computer station. Wait! Everyone turned immediately. The analyst enlarged another security feed from Penn Station. Grainy footage appeared near the terminal entrance around 8 p.m. Ethan Whitmore stepped briefly into frame, wearing a dark hooded jacket. Alive. The room inhaled all at once. Jonathan moved closer, so quickly the chair behind him nearly tipped backward. Pause it. Ethan stood near a newspaper stand, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder. Nervous, frightened, but alive. Then another figure entered the edge of the frame beside him. Claire narrowed her eyes instantly. Not Mercer. Not Connor. Someone else. A woman. Blonde hair tucked beneath a gray coat. The image quality blurred badly beneath the rain-covered camera lens. Can you sharpen the image? Jonathan asked sharply. The analyst adjusted the frame slowly. Eleanor suddenly gasped softly behind them. Claire turned immediately. The older woman had gone completely pale. No, Eleanor whispered. That cannot be right. Jonathan stared at the screen carefully. Then his expression froze. Claire looked back toward the image. This time she recognized the woman too. Caroline Whitmore, Jonathan's ex-wife. Ethan's mother. The woman who had not spoken to the family in almost 3 years. Caroline Whitmore had once been the most photographed woman in Manhattan. Magazine covers used to call her elegant, untouchable, born for high society. But the woman frozen on the grainy security footage no longer looked untouchable. She looked tired, nervous, human. The surveillance image remained paused on the monitor while silence swallowed the room once again. Claire Bennett watched Jonathan Whitmore carefully from beside the doorway. His face had gone completely still. Not angry, not shocked. Worse, wounded. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair, one trembling hand gripping the edge of the conference table for balance. Jonathan, she whispered softly. She would never hurt Ethan. Jonathan did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed locked on the screen where Caroline stood beside their missing son beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of Penn Station. Ethan looked anxious. Caroline looked afraid. But neither of them looked trapped. One of the FBI agents broke the silence carefully. Mr. Whitmore, when was the last time your ex-wife spoke to Ethan? Jonathan finally inhaled slowly through his nose. 3 months ago. His voice sounded distant now. Maybe 4. Connor rubbed both hands across his face again. Mom has not been involved with any of this. Jonathan turned toward him sharply. Then why did she meet Ethan in secret? Connor opened his mouth, closed it again. Claire noticed the hesitation instantly. Another hidden truth. Another family silence finally beginning to crack open. Eleanor noticed too. Connor, she whispered, what do you know? He looked exhausted beneath the cold lights. Mom called Ethan last week. Jonathan's expression hardened immediately. Why was I not told? Connor laughed bitterly under his breath. Because nobody tells each other anything in this family anymore. The words hung heavily in the room. Nobody argued with them. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the silver tray still resting in her hands. Wealth protected appearances, not relationships. Jonathan stepped closer toward the monitor again. Enhance the audio if possible. The analyst nodded and adjusted the station controls. Static crackled softly through the speakers while the grainy footage replayed. Ethan and Caroline stood near the station entrance speaking urgently. The camera had no direct microphone feed, but fragments of sound leaked through nearby security recordings. Distorted voices, footsteps, train announcements. Then finally, faintly, Caroline's voice emerged through the static. Cannot stay here tonight. Ethan answered too quietly to understand. Caroline shook her head sharply. Your father does not know who he trusts anymore. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Claire watched the tension move through his jaw. Then the footage continued. A dark sedan pulled toward the curb outside the station entrance. Caroline looked terrified the moment she saw it. Ethan turned quickly toward the street. Pause. Jonathan's voice cut sharply through the room. The analyst froze the frame. Claire narrowed her eyes carefully at the sedan. Black luxury model. Tinted windows. One headlight slightly dimmer than the other. Familiar. Something about it felt familiar. Jonathan stepped closer to the screen. Can we isolate the plate? The analyst zoomed carefully. Partial numbers appeared through the rain blur. Not enough for a full identification, but enough for Claire's instincts to tighten again. Connor suddenly looked away from the monitor. Tiny movement. Tiny panic. Claire noticed immediately. You recognize the car, she said quietly. The room turned toward her. Connor's face paled instantly. Jonathan followed his gaze back toward the screen. Connor. Silence. Connor. His voice sharpened harder this time. Connor finally whispered. Mercer uses that car. Eleanor gasped softly beneath her breath. Jonathan looked back toward the footage as though forcing himself to stay calm through sheer willpower alone. On the monitor, Caroline suddenly grabbed Ethan's arm urgently. Then both of them disappeared quickly into the station crowd just as the sedan pulled to the curb. The footage ended there. Can we track where they went next? Jonathan asked. The analysts immediately began checking transit feeds and traffic cameras across Lower Manhattan. Claire stepped quietly farther into the room now, setting the silver tray gently onto a side table for the first time all night. Nobody noticed anymore. Nobody remembered she technically did not belong there. The younger FBI agent turned toward Jonathan carefully. Your ex-wife may have been trying to protect Ethan. Jonathan stared silently at the dark screen. Or hide him. Eleanor shook her head immediately. Caroline would never run from Ethan. Never. Claire noticed how certain Eleanor sounded. Not hopeful. Certain. Jonathan slowly rubbed one hand across his mouth. She left this family 3 years ago without explanation. Eleanor looked suddenly older beneath the fluorescent lights. She left because she was drowning here. The room fell quiet again. Jonathan turned slowly toward his mother. What does that mean? Eleanor hesitated too long. Claire watched the billionaire carefully. He already knew there was more. Powerful people sensed hidden information the way sailors sense storms before clouds appeared. Eleanor lowered her gaze. Caroline used to tell me she felt invisible in this house. Jonathan almost laughed. Invisible. Eleanor nodded sadly. Everything became business. Schedules. Appearances. Control. Her eyes lifted toward him gently. You stopped listening to people unless they agreed with you. The words landed softly, but they landed hard. Claire looked toward Jonathan then. For the first time all night, the billionaire seemed genuinely shaken by something other than fear for Ethan. Truth did that sometimes. Not loud truth. Quiet truth. The kind spoken carefully by people who no longer had energy left to fight. Suddenly, one of the analysts sat upright again. We found another camera. Everyone turned immediately. New footage appeared from a traffic camera 3 blocks north of Penn Station. Caroline and Ethan rushed through heavy rain beneath a single umbrella. The black sedan followed slowly half a block behind them. Timestamp. Jonathan asked sharply. 8:27 p.m. The footage continued. Caroline suddenly pulled Ethan into a small 24-hour diner on the corner of Lexington and 33rd. The sedan drove past without stopping. Claire felt something tighten sharply inside her chest the moment the diner appeared on screen. She knew that place very well. Her eyes widened slightly. Jonathan noticed immediately. What is it? Claire hesitated only 1 second. I worked there before Whitmore House. The room went completely still again. Claire looked back toward the monitor where Caroline and Ethan disappeared inside the glowing diner entrance beneath the rain. Then she spoke quietly. And if Caroline was hiding Ethan there, she stopped. Jonathan stared at her carefully. What? Claire swallowed once. Then somebody inside that diner helped them. The drive through Manhattan felt quieter than the storm itself. Rain slid across the black SUV windows in long silver streaks, while the city lights blurred outside like distant memories nobody could hold onto clearly anymore. Jonathan Whitmore sat in the back seat beside Claire Bennett without speaking. Across from them, Eleanor held both hands tightly around a paper coffee cup she had not touched in 20 minutes. Connor remained in the second vehicle behind them with federal agents. Nobody trusted him enough to leave him alone anymore. The windshield wipers moved steadily through the darkness. Calm. Mechanical. Like a heartbeat trying to survive panic. Claire watched the empty streets carefully as the convoy moved downtown toward Lexington Avenue. The diner appeared exactly as she remembered it. Small. Warm. Forgettable to anyone with money. A narrow neon sign flickered softly against the rain while steam curled from vents above the kitchen roof. People with power never noticed places like this. That was why frightened people often hid there. Jonathan stared through the window at the diner entrance. You worked here? Claire nodded once. 3 years. Who owns it? A woman named Maria Delgado. Jonathan looked toward her carefully. Can she be trusted? Claire answered without hesitation. With her life. The SUV stopped beside the curb. Rain hammered softly against umbrellas as agents spread quietly around the block. Claire stepped out first beneath the cold December air. The smell of coffee and wet pavement hit her instantly. Familiar. Strange how certain places remembered pieces of people long after they left them behind. Jonathan exited behind her, his expensive coat darkening beneath the rain almost immediately. But he did not seem to notice. Wealth disappeared quickly when fear became personal enough. Inside the diner, warm yellow light spilled softly across checkered floors and old vinyl booths. A jazz song played quietly from the ceiling speakers, while only 3 late-night customers sat near the windows. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Claire spotted Maria immediately behind the counter. Mid-60s. Gray curls tied back loosely. Reading glasses hanging near the edge of her sweater. Maria looked up from the coffee machine and froze the moment she saw Claire. Claire. Surprise flashed across her face first. Then concern. Real concern. Her eyes moved immediately toward the federal agents entering behind Jonathan. What happened? Claire stepped carefully toward the counter. Maria, she said softly. Was Caroline Whitmore here tonight? Maria's expression changed instantly. Tiny pause. Tiny fear. Jonathan noticed it too. Please, Claire whispered gently. A boy is missing. Maria lowered her eyes briefly toward the counter. Back booth, she said quietly. 2 hours ago. Jonathan moved forward immediately. Where did they go? Maria looked up sharply. You are the father. Not a question. A realization. Jonathan nodded once. Maria sighed heavily beneath her breath. Then maybe you should sit down before I answer that. The entire diner suddenly felt smaller. Claire watched Jonathan carefully. Men like him were used to controlling information, not waiting for it. But exhaustion had finally stripped something away from him tonight. He slid quietly into the nearest booth without arguing. Rain tapped softly against the windows beside him. Maria poured fresh coffee into 3 mugs before sitting across from them. Caroline came here terrified, she said softly. Ethan too. Jonathan stared at the untouched coffee in front of him. Why? Maria hesitated. Because they thought someone inside your company was following them. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Mercer. Maria nodded slowly. Caroline recognized his car outside Penn Station. Claire remained silent beside the booth, while Eleanor carefully lowered herself into the seat next to Jonathan. Did Ethan say where he planned to go? Eleanor asked quietly. Maria looked toward Claire first before answering. North Station. Jonathan looked up immediately. Grand Central? No, Maria said softly. The old commuter line near Yonkers. Claire's heartbeat shifted slightly. That station had been abandoned for years except for a small overnight maintenance crew. Hidden. Quiet. Easy to disappear in temporarily. Jonathan stood instantly. Why would they go there? Maria's expression softened sadly. Because Caroline said Ethan needed somewhere nobody powerful would think to look. The sentence lingered heavily in the warm diner air. Jonathan slowly sat back down again. Claire watched the realization move through him piece by piece. Powerful men search through systems, through networks, through expensive technology. But frightened people survived by choosing places forgotten by power entirely. Maria suddenly reached beneath the counter and removed a folded white envelope. Caroline left this, she said quietly. She told me only to give it to Jonathan if federal agents arrived. The diner went silent again. Jonathan stared at the envelope for several long seconds before taking it carefully. His fingers trembled slightly for the first time all night. Inside rested a single handwritten page. Claire watched his eyes move slowly across the paper. Then his expression changed. Shock first, then something heavier. Regret. Eleanor whispered softly. What does it say? Jonathan swallowed once before reading aloud. Jonathan, if you are reading this, Ethan finally did what I could never do. He stopped being afraid of your world. The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. Mercer has been manipulating Whitmore media for years through people desperate enough to stay silent. Connor was weak, but he is not evil. Ethan found proof Mercer planned to frame Connor completely if the investigation ever began. Jonathan's voice weakened slightly as he continued. I tried warning you before I left, but you only listened to people who agreed with you. Silence swallowed the booth. Claire lowered her eyes quietly. Jonathan stopped reading for several seconds before forcing himself onward. Ethan did not run away from danger. He ran away because he thought you would protect the company before protecting him. Eleanor quietly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Jonathan stared at the final sentence on the page for a very long time without speaking. Claire watched him carefully. Some truths did not sound loud when spoken. They sounded tired. Finally, Jonathan whispered the last line aloud. For once in your life, stop acting like a billionaire long enough to be a father. Nobody in the diner moved. Nobody even touched the coffee anymore. Then suddenly one of the agents near the entrance lifted a hand toward his earpiece sharply. Sir. Jonathan looked up immediately. The agent stepped closer. We just traced Mercer's company vehicle heading north. Claire felt the entire booth tighten instantly. Toward Yonkers? Jonathan asked. The agent nodded once. Yes, sir. Jonathan slowly folded Caroline's letter with both hands. Then he stood. Calm again, but different now. Claire noticed it immediately. The man rising from that booth no longer looked like someone trying to protect an empire. He looked like a father finally understanding what he had almost lost. The abandoned Yonkers commuter station looked like a place the city had forgotten on purpose. Rainwater dripped steadily from rusted steel beams, while weak yellow maintenance lights flickered above the empty platform. The Hudson River moved silently beyond the tracks beneath the dark winter sky. Jonathan Whitmore stepped out of the SUV first, his coat soaked instantly by the freezing rain. Claire Bennett followed several steps behind beside two federal agents while the rest of the security convoy spread quietly around the station perimeter. Nobody raised their voices. Fear this deep did not need noise anymore. The station smelled like wet concrete and old metal. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed softly through the night. Claire studied the platform carefully while rain tapped against the cracked glass panels overhead. Then she saw it immediately. Fresh footprints near the stairwell leading toward the maintenance office. There, she whispered. Jonathan turned without hesitation. The group moved quickly through the narrow hallway beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Every sound seemed louder underground. Footsteps, breathing, water dripping from pipes above them. Jonathan reached the office door first. It stood partially open beneath a dim emergency light. Inside, the small room looked untouched except for two paper coffee cups resting beside an old radio on the desk. Steam no longer rose from them, but they were still warm. Claire touched one carefully. Recent, she said quietly. Then Jonathan saw him. Ethan Whitmore sat wrapped in a gray blanket near the far corner of the office beside Caroline Whitmore. Alive. Safe. For one brief second, the billionaire stopped breathing entirely. Ethan looked up immediately, eyes wide with exhaustion beneath messy dark hair. Dad. The word barely left his mouth before Jonathan crossed the room. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just directly. Like a man finally remembering where his heart existed outside business meetings and headlines. Ethan stood shakily as Jonathan reached him. Then suddenly the boy wrapped both arms around his father. Tight. Desperate. Jonathan held him immediately without speaking. Claire quietly looked away toward the rain-streaked window beside the office door. Some moments deserve privacy even inside broken families. Caroline slowly rose from the chair near the wall, exhaustion visible across her face. She looked older than the photographs Jonathan kept hidden in the mansion library, but her eyes remained sharp. Protective. He is okay, she said softly. Jonathan nodded once without releasing Ethan. I know. Ethan pulled back slightly after several long seconds. I tried calling you before everything got worse, he whispered. Jonathan's face tightened painfully. I know, but the truth was heavier than that. He had not known. Not really. Not until tonight. Caroline stepped closer carefully. Mercer found out Ethan copied files from Connor's laptop. She explained quietly. Ethan panicked and came to me. Claire remained silent near the doorway while federal agents quietly secured the area outside. Jonathan finally released his son slowly and turned toward Caroline. Rain reflected silver across the office floor between them. 3 years of silence stood there too. You should have told me, Jonathan said quietly. Caroline almost smiled. Sad. Tired. Would you have listened? Jonathan opened his mouth, then stopped, because he already knew the answer. Ethan sat slowly on the edge of the desk, exhaustion pulling heavily at his voice now. Mercer said Connor would take the blame for everything if the company investigation started. Jonathan turned sharply. Where is Mercer now? Caroline exchanged a glance with Ethan first. Gone, she answered softly. The moment Victor Hale realized federal agents were involved, Mercer disappeared. One of the agents entered the doorway quietly. Sir, we recovered Mercer's abandoned vehicle 3 miles south. Empty. Jonathan nodded once. No anger. No victory either. Just exhaustion. The storm outside had finally started slowing to a light drizzle now. Claire noticed it through the office windows. Manhattan storms always sounded softer near morning. Eleanor Whitmore entered the office moments later wrapped tightly in her cream-colored shawl. The second she saw Ethan alive, tears filled her eyes instantly. Ethan crossed the room and hugged her carefully while she whispered his name over and over against his hair. Connor appeared in the hallway behind her under agent supervision. He looked destroyed. Not dangerous anymore. Just ashamed. Ethan slowly looked toward his older brother across the room. Silence stretched painfully between them. Then Connor finally spoke first. I am sorry. Ethan studied him quietly for several long seconds. I know. Connor lowered his eyes immediately. I never wanted any of this. Ethan's voice remained soft. I know that too. Sometimes forgiveness sounded quieter than guilt. Jonathan stood near the rain-covered window, watching both sons carefully. Claire noticed something had changed inside him tonight. The sharpness was still there. The control. But something colder had finally broken apart beneath it. The belief that power alone could protect what mattered. Caroline stepped beside him slowly. You built walls around yourself for so long, she whispered gently. Eventually nobody knew how to reach you anymore. Jonathan stared out toward the empty tracks disappearing into darkness. I thought protecting the company protected the family. Caroline shook her head faintly. No, you protected the company so much that everyone inside the family learned to hide their pain from you. Silence settled softly through the small office. No shouting, no dramatic apologies. Just truth finally spoken out loud after years of being buried beneath wealth and pride. Claire quietly stepped backward toward the hallway, intending to disappear before anyone noticed. But Jonathan's voice stopped her. Claire. She turned slowly. Jonathan looked at her carefully beneath the pale station lights. You saw everything before the rest of us did. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Sometimes people speak loudly without words. Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Then finally he asked the question that had quietly followed him all night. Why did you keep trying to help after I dismissed you? Claire glanced toward Ethan beside his grandmother, then back toward Jonathan. Because your son was frightened, she answered softly. And frightened people need someone willing to listen before it is too late. The station fell quiet again except for distant rain tapping softly against the tracks outside. Jonathan looked down briefly at the gold watch still resting around his wrist. The same watch he had checked endlessly during meetings, negotiations, interviews, entire years of his life. Then slowly, for the first time in a very long time, he removed it. No speech, no performance. Just a quiet man standing inside an abandoned train station beside the family he had almost lost forever. Claire turned toward the hallway again, ready to leave quietly the way invisible people always did. But before she stepped outside, Jonathan spoke one final sentence into the silence behind her. You were the only person brave enough to tell me the truth. Claire paused near the doorway beneath the flickering station light. Then she answered without turning around. No, Mr. Whitmore. Her voice stayed soft. Calm. Certain. I was just the first person you finally decided to hear.